good evening. Good evening. Good evening. That's better. How are you all? Thanks so much for coming out tonight. For those who don't know me, I'm Peter Riddell. I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor in Indigenous at the University of Canberra, and I've had a long association with the University of Canberra, having graduated with an undergraduate and a master's degree here before coming back to work. This is my third time being employed by UC. It keeps bringing me back. We've got a great speaker tonight, but before I actually introduce our speaker, I want to introduce Auntie Jude Barlow and ask her to come and do a welcome to this wonderful Ngunnawal country that we live on.
It's in my face. So Yuma, which is hello in Ngunnawal, and it's a gift from the Ngunnawal people to you all, so you can say that every day if you like. Galangu, which means I am, Jude Barlow, and I'm a Ngunnawal woman. My family are Wallabaloa people, a family group within the Ngunnawal Nation. And it is a real pleasure to be with you this evening. I begin today by acknowledging my family and ancestors. I would also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present tonight, and I honour their elders past, present and emerging. So I'm going to do a little bit, because this lecture has fallen in NAIDOC week, so I'm going to give you my thoughts on NAIDOC week tonight rather than talk about the lecture. So as you may know, this year's theme for NAIDOC week is always was, always will be. And now Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have always been here. We are part of the land, part of the landscape. And despite deliberate policy to sever our connection to land and culture, we remain custodians of an ancient land with which we have lived for thousands of years. And in New South Wales at least, since 1901, when the Aborigines Protection Act was enacted, there was deliberate policy to remove us from our ancient culture, from our ancient lands. We were removed from our cultural and spiritual homes onto reservations and missions across this nation. At Yass, where I was born, there was a mission called Hollywood, and clearly, as you can tell, they called it Hollywood because all the women were so beautiful. And places like Hollywood and Arambi Mission in Canberra, where I was removed to, it was more often than not built on the outskirts of towns, and were make-do settlements made from corrugated iron and pieced together by the clever men to protect their families. And families were provided with blankets which were rationed, so each member had only one blanket. And you know how cold it gets here on this country. And before these impositions, our First Nations peoples lived with and understood the land. After invasion, we lost so much. Often our language, often our lives or the lives of loved ones, and our connection to country was almost severed. But we are a resilient people. We are an adaptable people. And we have survived, and it is now time for truth-telling. And this year's NAIDOC theme is a reminder that no matter how we are changed and how we are removed, this was and has always been and will always be Aboriginal land. And now that we enter that era of truth-telling, of healing, and of all being well together, and in the language of my ancestors, we have a word which means being well together, and that word is Ngunnawal. So I want us to be Ngunnawal on this beautiful country of my ancestors. Always was, always will be is also about recognising our ancient past and embracing that past to build a future that is sustainable, cultural and kind. Recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' long connection to country allows us all to embrace and care for our environment and each other. And we should all travel together on this land that has always been Aboriginal land. And it is a journey we travel together where we practice Yinjamara, a Ngunnawal and Wiradjuri word meaning honour and respect. And more broadly, it implies thoughtfulness, graciousness and kindness. And now I would like to welcome you to the land of my ancestors in the language of my ancestors, which I'm newly learning, so forgive me if I stumble. Yangu nalamanyin, dunimanyin, nonawalwari darawawari, marabiji malngari jinila, kolambani yarabinyin naraganawali ninyan, nona yarabi yangu, yumalundi, nonawalwari darawawari. And this means, together we are all gathering on Ngunnawal country. And this country is my ancestors' spiritual homeland, and we are keeping the pathways of our ancestors alive by walking together as one. Welcome to Ngunnawal country.
Thank you so much, Auntie Jude. That's actually a very powerful start to the evening. Thank you so much for your welcome to country. That's fantastic. If I can also just acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional lands of Ngunnawal people. If I can pinch just a couple of words, Darawalwari, Ngunnawalwari, that this is Ngunnawal land and University of Canberra sits on that land. We just want to acknowledge the contribution that your people make, Auntie Jude, to the culture and the fabric of University of Canberra. For those who don't know, Auntie Ros was meant to be here tonight and she couldn't be, so Auntie Jude sort of stepped in at the last minute, so I really appreciate that. But Auntie Ros is our elder in residence and she guides most of the staff and students in the university. And for those who wonder if she keeps me in line, that is a definite yes when I step out of line. So I just want to acknowledge everyone too that's actually streaming in tonight, so I really appreciate you coming along. Now, our speaker tonight, we're very lucky to have an incredible person, someone who's a role model for so many on both sides of Parliament, if you like. The Honourable Linda Burney MP, Shadow Minister for Family and Social Services, Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians and Minister for Barton. Linda was elected a federal member for Barton in 2016, following a 14-year career in the New South Wales Parliament as a member for Canterbury. During her state political career, she served as Minister in a number of senior portfolios, including as Minister for Community Services and later as Deputy Leader of the Opposition, a job that I'm sure was tricky. Following her election to the Federal House of Representatives, she was immediately appointed Shadow Minister for Human Services, and she has since been appointed as Shadow Minister for Families and Social Services and Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians. As a proud Wiradjuri woman from a Wiradjuri nation, Linda was the first Aboriginal person to be elected in New South Wales Parliament and the first Aboriginal woman to serve in the Australian House of Representatives. Linda's commitment to Indigenous issues spans more than 30 years. Seems like a long time, doesn't it? She began her career as a teacher in Western Sydney and then as an education bureaucrat before becoming appointed a Director General of the Department of Aboriginal Affairs. The wonderful work that she's done, and also being the first Aboriginal graduate with an honorary doctorate in education in 2002. Linda has long held a commitment to the prevention of domestic violence and family violence and has detailed publicly her experiences with that. She has held senior positions in the non-government sector, serving on a number of boards, including SBS and the New South Wales Discrimination Board and the New South Wales Board of Studies. But probably what's not in that bio is actually she was the first Aboriginal member of the University of Canberra Council in the late 90s. So she got a great...
Fabulous welcome to country and an explanation how you feel about the week we are in, NAIDOC week. Now, I'm not sure if this was planned, but somehow or other it's all worked out. The Ngunnawal lecture is being delivered during NAIDOC week. And of course, we all know that NAIDOC week is generally in the second week of July. But because of the fact that we are a small audience with people streaming in, and hello to all of you, it is what it is. But thank you for that fabulous welcome and a really important contribution about what NAIDOC Week means and where it stands in this country. We saw each other at the Carillion on Sunday night. Unfortunately, the light show was a bit early and the sun was still out. But anyway, not to worry, it was still a fabulous evening. I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of this land on which we are gathering tonight. And I do pay my respects to elders of the Ngunnawal Nation, both past and present. And whilst Auntie Rosalind's not here tonight, I know she plays an important part in the university, and I acknowledge her. And of course, Jude for her welcome to country. It is upon their ancestral lands the University of Canberra sits, and I know that you wouldn't be here if you weren't absolutely aware of those facts and that issue. I want to extend my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and there are many of you here tonight from all over Australia in your attendance today. And I say to you all, Happy NAIDOC Week. Yes, it's worth a clap. You know, it's really interesting that that theme this year always will be, in my mind, because perhaps of my age and the fact that that theme came out of the land rights movement and the civil rights movement. The rest of that, if you're not aware, is always will be, always was Aboriginal land. And I'm sure that many people here know that. I want to really recognise Peter and the role that you've played here. I have a whole list of people in my speech to acknowledge, and I know that Professor Tom Calma, the Chancellor of the University, how amazing a First Nations person as the Chancellor of this university. And if Tom were here, I would completely embarrass him. I have known him for, I reckon, 40 years, and that's absolutely very. And of course, the Vice Chancellor, Paddy Nixon, but everyone else at the university staff. I know there are a lot of you here this evening. A very special hello. The University of Canberra has been a leader in the advancement of First Nations education and employment, and you should all feel a great pride in that. And I'm sure that everyone here tonight has been or is part of that. It has established the Office of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Leadership and Strategy, and it's over halfway through its Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander strategic plan, which seeks to increase Indigenous student completion, boost Indigenous employment within the university workforce, improve cultural competency amongst the staff, which is so important, and students, and build a First Nation research capacity. The latest University of Canberra Indigenous Student Success Program 2019 reports show improvements in education outcomes in a range of indicators. And let me tell you, in this age of COVID, that is particularly powerful. I want to commend the university's commitment to putting these goals into practice and delivering real and tangible progress. I also, on the university, I was, as it was just mentioned, I was on the university council here for some time. I have to say that I'm not quite sure that I felt qualified, but I learned so much about your sector and the importance of good governance. So much about your sector as I spent time on that council. Can I thank the University of Canberra for the invitation to deliver this year's lecture in very unusual circumstances. It's an honour and a privilege to join such an illustrious list of speakers from the past. In 2012, you had Tom Calma, Helen Milroy, Fiona Stanley, who's one of my heroes, and Michael Chandler. In 2013, you had Chris Sarah, who is another one of my heroes. You realise how old you are when you start realising that you know most of these people. Professor Lisa Jackson-Pulver, whom I also know, in 2014. Janine Lian in 2015. I don't know Janine, but she was the Wiradjuri woman and the university's first female Aboriginal and Torres Strait undergraduate. And I have to say, yay to Wiradjuri women. Not that I'm being biased. Professor Gary Foley, whom I've known for a very, very long time. Anita Heiss, who I've also known for a very long time. Mick Gooder in 2018, who spoke about race, power and constitutional referendum. And I am going to touch on those things this evening. Professor Yin Paradis in 2019. So I am very conscious we've got two wonderful young women here tonight, and I hope that some of the things that I can share touches you, because you are our future. And I have absolutely every confidence in our young people. I'm getting quite emotional because I see in you strength, I see in you an understanding that we didn't have, and I see in you a way to take us forward. So thank you for coming tonight with your mum. The land of the Ngunnawal encompasses the city of Canberra in the south. It stretches towards Tumut and Cootamundra in the west and up towards Young in the north. It was home to an abundance of yam daisies prior to European settlement, a staple of the Ngunnawal diet. It is also home to a seasonal abundance of bogong moths, which were rich in fats and oils. I remember when the bogong moths were very, very prolific, and they overtook most of Canberra at the time. And I remember distinctly in New South Wales, when they invited the New South Wales Parliament, I was driving out of the car park one night, and the moths were just covering the car park walls. It was amazing. I didn't understand the cultural significance at that time, but I do now. When Labor held a smoking ceremony before our caucus on Tuesday morning, Paul House spoke of the Bogong Month. This week, we observe NAIDOC Week. It is not normal at this time of year, but these are not normal times. And thank you so much for making the time to come tonight. It's pretty good grog, and I'm looking at the food, and that looks pretty good as well. As all of you would know, this is typically in July, but shifted to November because of the pandemic. We obviously won't get to celebrate in the way we usually do, but the fact that Ngunnawal lecture has fallen this week, whether by design, kind of. I think that's very good. By design or by chance, I think more by design. It's looking absolutely fabulous, and I really do want to recognise NAIDOC Week. And I want to share with you, and some of you may know this already, but I want to share with you a little bit of the history of NAIDOC Week, because it is not recent. It is something that goes back to our great grandparents and aunts. NAIDOC Week is a celebration of First Nations people, our culture and our achievements, our experience and our knowledge. But we must never forget the history of NAIDOC Week. It is grounded in the protest, struggle and resistance, as Aunt told us. Shortly before the 1920s, Aboriginal rights group began using the 26th of January as a day to protest the status and treatment of First Australians. On 26th of January 1938, Aboriginal rights group gathered and marched through the streets of Sydney, over 1,000 people. In 1938, just think about it. Think about it. 1,000 Aboriginal people marched through the street with what was known as the Day of Mourning, gathering at Australia House. And you all know that famous photo from that time. And I am so proud of this photo because the little toddlers in the front is my great aunt, Auntie Esther, who is now 84 years old. So I will have great delight in sharing with her our discussion tonight. It was regarded as one of the first major civil rights demonstrations, not just in our country, but across the world. And my God, how good is that? How strong is that? Among the organisers were great names, you know, in the Parthenon of history. Bill Ferguson, Jack Patton, and other members of the Aboriginal Progressive Association. William Cooper, who has now got a federal seat in Parliament named after him. It used to be named after John Batman. What a dog. It is now named after William Cooper. And the Australian Aboriginal League, Margaret Tucker, John Conley, Tom Foster, Pearl Gibbs, Helen Grosvenor, Jack Johnson, Jack Kinchler, Bert Marr, Pastor Doug Nichols, Henry Noble, Tom Peachman, and Frank Roberts. They are names that are part of our story. They are names that are part of our history. And they will become more prominent, I promise you, as we go forward. And while we met with resistance from Australia's political leaders of the day, it left a mark on the nation's consciousness and it created an awareness among the Australian public. And that's what we're about tonight, leaving a mark on the Australian consciousness. Between 1940 and 1954, the Day of Mourning was held annually on Sunday before 26 January. It became known as Aborigines Day. In 1955, not long before I was born, I'm really old, it was shifted to the first Sunday in July, which is something that we're all becoming much more familiar with. It was decided that the day should be a celebration of First Nations culture and not just a day of protest. Do you get what I'm saying? Can you see the growth? Can you see the development? It was at this time the National Aborigines Day Observers Committee. It was formed. For the first time, everyone, in 1974, the committee was composed entirely of First Nations members. This coincided at a time in Australian history when the Whitlam Labor government was pursuing greater self-determination for First Australians. The stars lined up. The stars lined up. It was during this period that we saw the creation of the National Aboriginal Consultative Council. This was an elected body of 40 members who were to advise the Aboriginal Affairs Minister to better involve Indigenous Australians in the decisions of government. An early echo of an Indigenous voice, maybe. Not that we're talking about that much now, wrong, but maybe that was where the idea came from. This was one of the first iterations of self-determinations for our people. In 1975, everyone, Aborigines Day was extended to become a week, which stretched from the first Sunday to the second Sunday of July, and NAIDOC Week was born. Not this year, but that's normally what it is. By 1991, the Commission added Islander into the name to become National Aborigines and Islanders Day Observance Committee, or NAIDOC as you know it now. The decision came at a time when Torres Strait Islanders began receiving greater recognition as a people and a culture. And I think that's really important, to recognise in our country we have two Indigenous cultures. The cultures, or the many cultures of mainland Australia and Tasmania, but also recognising the extraordinary contribution of the people of the Torres Strait. And just remember Eddie Mabo, who gave us an enormous gift. Eddie didn't live to see it. He died a few months before the Mabo decision of the High Court. But the High Court in 1992, that's why I've got Daryl here, who helped me with this speech, and thank you, Daryl, who in 1992, through his persistent efforts, for the first time in law in this country, said that terra nullius was a myth. That's what the High Court decision in Mabo was really about. It was a myth. And that we had been here for 65,000 years plus, and in our culture, in our law, and in our story from the beginning of time. The decision came at a time when Torres Strait Islanders, as I said, began receiving greater recognition. And I want to speak about the fact that the Torres Strait Islander people have their own flag. You all know it: blue, green, black, and white. And it represents the colours of the Torres Strait, the vegetation, the people, and of course, the sea. I won't go into detail because I don't have it in front of me, but I think the durry, which is the headdress in the middle of the Torres Strait Islander flag, the points of that represent the number of islands in the Torres Strait. And Bernard Namak was the designer of their flag. Today in NAIDOC is an opportunity to celebrate our achievements, culture, connection to country, as well as reflect on the challenges ahead. And there are challenges ahead. I want to pay tribute to Anne Martin and Ben Mitchell, who served as co-chairs on the National NAIDOC Committee from 2008 to 2018. And of course, the new chairs are John Paul Janke and Pat Turner. The theme of this year's NAIDOC was, as I said, always will be. The committee statement says always was, always will be, recognises that First Nations people have occupied and cared for our country, our continent, for over 65,000 years. It goes on to say, everyone, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were Australia's first explorers, first navigators, and if you watch the ABC, who watches the ABC? Put your hand up even if you don't. First navigators, first engineers, first farmers, first botanists, first scientists, first diplomats, first astronomers, which is my favourite, and first artists. This year's theme is an acknowledgement and a celebration of the breadth and the depth of our people's knowledge and experiences, our stories, and our connection to country. Australia is home of the oldest living, surviving civilization on Earth. I can't say that without being astounded every time. Just think about it. Just think about what a gift that we bring to this country. That is the heritage, and that is the story of Australia. And the word's getting out. The word's getting out. Such is the vastness of our history, our knowledge, and our experience. And I love this quick fact. You might, if any of you do trivia, you can use this. I give you permission. If you condense First Nations people's 60,000 years or more year history into a 24-hour period, follow me here, folks. Captain Cook only arrives in Australia a mere 6 minutes before midnight. That's pretty good, isn't it? There is so much we can learn from first Australians over the 60,000 years of history. There should be a source of pride for all Australians. And I made that point time and time again to the media this week, First Nations and non-Indigenous alike. I found just some of these facts absolutely fascinating, and I don't want to spin this out too long. And I know I'll say this wrong, but if any of you are scientists, you can throw something at me later, but not now. Hyacinth butyrol bromide is a medicine used to treat stomach cramps and dilate the eyes. It is derived, everyone, from a Queensland rainforest tree, the soft corkwood. This use was derived from traditional Aboriginal uses to treat stomach aches. Today, it's known as buscopan. I've taken it, I can tell you that. This usage was observed at a time when First Nation rights to knowledge was not recognised, a time before they could enjoy the benefits from the commercialisation of this knowledge. Buscopan is so widely used. It is well known that Indigenous Australians do not enjoy the intellectual property rights to the knowledge. Everyone, today in Northern Australia, the Mirarr people are trialling commercial plantations of the Kakadu plum. This fruit is the richest known source of vitamin C in the world, with potential applications in food, beauty, and health industries. According to the Gingerhamai Aboriginal Corporation, the Kakadu plum, featuring in many oral histories and dreaming stories, has been an important source of food and medicine for the Mirarr for thousands of years. While it is good to see the Mirarr people so involved in the commercial activities around the Kakadu plum, there is concerns continue to be raised about whether they are receiving proper compensation for their knowledge. I think I know the answer. The Wurji Yuang Stone Circle in Victoria, sometimes referred to as the Aboriginal Stonehenge, maps the rising and setting sun at the solstices and the equinoxes. Dwayne Hamacher of the University of New South Wales writes about how Indigenous traditional knowledge and stories have accurately recorded meteor strikes and volcanic eruptions. Henbury, 455 kilometres south of Alice Springs, is the location of a meteoric strike, you know what I mean, some 4,007 years ago, an event which is featured in traditional stories of the Luritja people. They're recorded histories. They're not myths and legends. They are real recorded histories. He says these stories have enabled scientists to locate these events that they would otherwise have not known about. So our dreaming stories have been incredibly important to scientific knowledge. He also says that these stories have also depicted sea level changes and volcanic eruptions, citing the Iquam, Aramo, and the Brine crater lakes in northern Queensland more than 10,000 years ago. And Robert Fuller, also from the University of New South Wales, has written about how ancient Aboriginal star maps have shaped Australia's highway network, the roads that we drive on today. And let me tell you how. Patterns of stars were used to show waypoints or travel routes. Think of the Seven Sisters dreaming. Fuller discusses how the method of teaching these patterns or routes were through songs, an effective way of memorising a sequence in the oral transmission of knowledge, what we now call songlines. Absolute application to today. Fuller studied routes between 7,000 kilometres and 15,000 kilometres. One route, everyone, and I just found this so interesting, from Quilpie, Queensland, traversed the Simpson Desert to Arunta north of Alice Springs. Another connected Gaduga to the Munya Mountains and the Carnarvon Gorge in Queensland. He explained that this knowledge was later adopted by local drovers and settlers, which eventually became the framework for our modern highways. Think about it. It's amazing. Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu really exploded the myth of first Australians as hunter-gatherers and explored the strong evidence of sophisticated farming and agricultural practice. Now, if you haven't read Bruce Pascoe's Dark Dreaming, shame on you, because you have to. And you also might buy about 10 copies for Christmas presents this year. And as we have been recently seen from the bushfires over the summer, Indigenous Australians are gaining international recognition for managing wildfires with cool burns. The government's Emission Reduction Fund has also embraced these practices. More broadly, the science and policy groups are increasingly recognising that the need to incorporate Indigenous fire knowledge into land management strategies is absolutely crucial. Hallelujah. This is not only for environmental reasons, but also for requirements around insurance, audits and fire reports, as well as the meeting of Australia's international greenhouse gas reduction targets. Who would have thought? So let me move on to a couple of things and then I will stop speaking and you can ask me some questions. You would have noticed there's a fair bit been happening in the Parliament this week. Firstly, let me talk about the Uluru Statement. I know all of you understand what that means. The Uluru Statement was a culmination of 12 deliberative dialogues all over this country. And believe it or not, it talked about three things in the end. It talked about a constitutionally enshrined voice to the Parliament. It talked about a process of truth-telling. It also talked about agreement making through a Makarrata Commission, which is really talking about treaty. And I want to say that the party that I represent is the only party that I'm aware of in that place, a few kilometres from here on the hill, that embraces the Uluru Statement in its entirety. The gathering at Uluru, believe it or not, was 3.5 years ago, and we're still talking about it. It was in July last year, after two years after the summit, that the Minister for Indigenous Australians, Ken White, announced a path for delivering on the statement. At the beginning of this year, he announced a co-designed body for a national Indigenous voice to government, as well as a body for local and regional voice to government. Recent events have clearly disrupted the political landscape. Can I also say that what we've seen over the last little while is the incredible Black Lives Matter movement, which I'm sure some of our young people here have a lot more to say about than me. But what the Black Lives Matter movement really meant for Australia was an absolute focus on deaths in custody and the incarceration rates of our people. It is crucial, absolutely crucial, that we stay true to the three principles, the three values, the three statements of Uluru. And it is going to be extremely important that, that the debate coming up through the Parliament over the next 12 months will see what really happens. To me, Labor has a commitment to a constitutionally enshrined voice to the Parliament. And I can give you an assurance tonight, as the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians, that that will not change. The real politics are hard, they're not pretty. but I have been around this old trap for a few years, and I know how they work. We'll play those games. We'll do what's necessary. But I can promise you that at some point into the future, there will be a constitutionally enshrined voice to the Parliament. There will be a treaty with First Nations people, and there will be a national process of truth-telling. Some of the core principles that Labor would like to see in the proposed design of a voice are these. The voice has to be democratically elected. Otherwise, it won't have legitimacy. And importantly, and I say this to all the women tonight, it will have equal gender representation. It will have. And I want to say this also about the voice. Young people will be at the table. It should be advisory and non-justiciable, in line with what the Uluru Settlement said. But it must be secure and it must be it must be permanent. I would like to say that we saw what can happen when it is not a permanent voice, with the example of ATSIC. The second element of the Uluru Statement is a process about truth-telling. And this is where you and this institution is so important in the process of truth-telling. As our holders of stories pass on, so do these stories live. Local governments have an important role, as to educational institutions. Let me tell you one quick story, and I'm almost finished, about what truth-telling can mean at the local level. Last year, I was on the Eyre Peninsula. I didn't even know where that was, but I know now, in South Australia, and was told the story of the Waterloo Bay Massacre. I visited a monument that tells the story of up to 200 defenceless First Nations people being forced off a cliff at gunpoint. It was an atrocious massacre. There was an intense debate in the community about the monument that was going to be put up in place to recognise what had happened. With some wanting to use the word incident, and others wanting to use the word massacre. In the end, the Yellowstone Council decided by a single vote, which tells us that we have work to do, by a single vote, that the use of the word massacre would take place on that monument. That's important because the process of healing can continue. You probably are all very, very familiar, as I am, with a massacre site of recognition in Mile Creek in the wider region of New South Wales, up near this side of Moree. It's another powerful example of the transformative power of truth-telling. On the 10th of July in 1838, a group of Warriere people were attacked by convicts and settlers when they were preparing for a meal. They were slaughtered and their bodies were burned. There was one young boy, I think he was about 8 years old, that survived. But now, in that place, out near Bingra, this side of Moree, the descendants of those that were massacred, the descendants of those that did the massacring, have come together and created a monument that overlooks the site where the massacre happened. It's just extraordinary. And what's amazing about that site, the monument's beautiful, is that when you go, you take something from your country, whether it's a handful of sand or a eucalyptus leaf or a rock, and you leave it at the massacre site. It's just amazing. I've been there on a number of occasions. And it seems to me that the Mare Creek massacre was the first time, if you're not historians, where in Australia the perpetrators that did the massacring were brought to justice and they were hung. Of course, this story is just one of many. Libraries, museums, universities, cultural institutions can help in this process of truth-telling. Now, in the Parliament this week, we also had the issue of the Aboriginal flag and the national anthem. You can ask me questions about that. I won't go into detail. But let me tell you that the Liberal National Party that oppose the hanging of the Aboriginal flag in the Senate are on the wrong side of history. The wrong side of history. And the great act of truth-telling could have happened in your Parliament this week, and it was denied by one vote, 28 to 29. But we're not going to give up, are we? It'll happen again. It's inevitable. Don't know about that big Australian flag off the top, but let me see what we can do about what's inside. Can I just finish up by saying a few things? On Wednesday, we saw the New South Wales Premier re-spark the conversation on words about the national anthem. And I have to say, I've known Gladys Berejiklian for a long time. Gladys and I were elected on the same day in 2003. She is a good and decent person. Different side of politics, but that's the way it is. And I think her suggestion of the change of the words young and free to one and free, I really welcome that. Just remembering, of course, that the national anthem has changed in the past. It's just to talk about Australian sons rejoicing, and that was changed. So I think that this one's a great process of truth-telling and also something that's very, very sensible. Can I completely finish up now, everyone, by saying the final element of the Uluru Statement is about agreement making for treaty, and it requires long-term commitment. Treaty is a very easy word to say. Treaty now is even easier. Treaty is happening in a number of states and territories, but we need a national treaty as well. But we need a voice to negotiate that treaty with. That makes sense. Treaty is not something you rush into, and our communities, First Nation communities, have to be treaty ready. And we are heading towards this goal. It won't happen overnight, but let me assure you, it will happen. It seems to me that the leadership shown about this is going to be incredibly important. So in conclusion, through you, Pro-Vice-Chancellor, gosh, that's so brainy. Can I just, I feel a bit intimidated by it actually. Can I just finish up by saying in conclusion, thank you so much for being here tonight. I am confident that when Australia fulfills the aspirations of the Uluru Statement of listening, of learning and agreement making, we can and will more warmly embrace and celebrate our First Nations history, our past and our truth. This is an opportunity for the Prime Minister and the government to build a lasting legacy. My party, Labor, is willing to work with the government to achieve this, and I think I've demonstrated that over the last few years. We have consistently offered the hand of bipartisanship, but my final point is this: bipartisanship cannot, ever be a race to the bottom. Thanks, everyone.
Well, wasn't that a powerful talk by a very powerful woman? In fact, Linda, if I can just say that I sit there with a position Pro Vice Chancellor because of the work that you've done in those 30 years. So,
Thank you.
so I think the brainy one's here and the lucky one is here. So for all the hard work that you've done. There's a couple of things I just really picked up. I mean, first scientists, the first astronomers, and Captain Cook has only been here for 6 minutes to midnight, and colonisation. I think that's really, it really tells a lot, really, doesn't it, in terms of a story about how long we've been here. Does a kakadu plum replace hair?
I don't know.
I know you said it's about beauty, but maybe I need both hair and beauty. Look, and the stories in terms of the astronomy, and I want to share just one thing. I've learned a lot of things. I spent 2 years working at the University of Newcastle as a dean there. And one of the stories that the Wabakal people tell is about the kangaroo and Nobby's head on Nobby's beach. Incredible. And no one really understood what that was, what that meaning, that oral story meant until the earthquake in 1989. Then, of course, we all knew what it meant after that. And the voice to Parliament, that is a wonderful thing. And I didn't really connect the voice to the treaty. And of course, that's going to make a big difference to actually having a treaty. For those, I'm sure I'm talking to the converted here, but Australia is the only first world country that doesn't have a treaty with its Indigenous peoples. And that was a misstep a long time ago. And as a result, and I don't know if you get the great opportunity to travel internationally, but when I travel internationally at conferences, everyone says, oh yeah, you're Aboriginal from Australia. We had the Maori here from New Zealand. We understand what goes on in the Southern Hemisphere. And I said, there's a small piece of water between us, but in terms of cultural rights, we are worlds apart. So a treaty has made a big difference, even though it's not enshrined in law in New Zealand. It has made a big difference to Indigenous rights or Māori rights in New Zealand. So I look forward to that day. What a wonderful talk. Can I just give another round of applause for Linda, please? We have, and Linda's very generous for the time tonight, so I really appreciate that. So we have time for a few questions. So anyone have a burning question for Linda? Astrid.
I'll take 3.
3. Oh, there you go. Perfect.
Because my feet are hurting. I've been on them all day.
Hi, Annie Linda. Thank you for an amazing talk, as usual. I have a query around how the Uluru Statement thing will work. I'm just wondering, in New Zealand, they have the Maori Party, which gives 6 or 7 representatives from the Maori people a seat in their federal parliament. Would you like to see the same sort of system here in Australia?
No.
No? Okay.
Which probably surprises you. So, and thank you for that question. So, in New Zealand, there is a party called the Maori Party. I think at the last election, they have nobody in the parliament. They used to. But I think the challenge with the Maori Party, if you're Maori in New Zealand, you could be on either the electoral roll that voted for everyone, or on the roll that only voted for the Maori Party. That's not well understood. So it seems to me, and I've controversially argued that there shouldn't be dedicated seats in the parliament. And I know that hasn't pleased everyone, and perhaps it's a bit of a bias for me because I contested a seat and won it handsomely in the state parliament, and then I had to contest a seat in the federal parliament where there was a sitting Liberal bloke, which I dispense with quickly, and won the seat. I just think that that dual system is very different to the system that we have in Australia. And I would prefer to see I can only talk about my party, but I would prefer to see our state, what do they call, Darryl, like Sussex Street, what's that called? Our state political administrative side of the party pre-select Aboriginal people in winnable seats. That's what they should be doing, and that's what I've been arguing for a long time. I was pre-selected in a really winnable seat, but that's not the experience of all First Nations people. So what needs to happen is not the creation of a new party. Our administrative wings need to get their acts together to pre-select First Nations people in spots that they're going to win that will guarantee them to be in Parliament.
The knowledge tonight has been really, really great to hear. And also the point about the yam daisies, they're still around, but not very many. There's still some on Mount Ainslie. And good point about the national anthem that you and I both would have had to sing God Save the Queen when we were kids.
I certainly did, and salute the flag.
Yeah. So look, my question, I'm a little bit hesitant to ask it, but you've been in politics.
Oh, come on, just spit it out.
So look, my wife comes from Chile, and so like most people in Chile, about 90% of people, she's of descent of heritage, part Indigenous and part Spanish.
Yes.
And there was a huge earthquake there in 1960, and about 100 kilometres from where she lived, a remote Mapuche community felt fervently that the spirit of the earth and the sea had been disturbed, and what was needed was a sacrifice of a 5-year-old child and 2 horses. And so and also that's pretty mild compared with what the Scottish and Danish used to do. They killed a lot of people that they accused of witchcraft from having caused storms that affected King Charles's voyage in 1590. So I'm thinking, is there a way of keeping the good parts of the culture, the knowledge, the language, all the stories, but letting go of some of the letting go of some of those less positive aspects? So
I don't think there's any human sacrifices anymore anyway. Let's hope
still
not.
sorcery and still some curses and things up in the Northern Territory.
Look, thank you for that. That's a very complex question. I've actually been to Chichen Itza and saw the altars in Mexico where some of the sacrifices happened. I think that cultures, and I can only speak about First Nations cultures in Australia, the first thing is to recognise, as Aunt would say, and I'm sure everyone would say, is that to think of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as homogenous in Australia is completely wrong. I'm Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Anu. We're all different languages, different stories, different cultures, different dreamings, with songlines that connect all of us. So I think just got to take the lot. The point that I make about the shared history that we have in Australia, some of it is bloody ugly. It's horrid, but it happened. It's the truth. And I understand what you're saying about, and I've got a woman from Chile, Darryl and I, on our staff. And it is part of belief, and I've just finished reading an amazing book by Richard Feidler and Kari, can't remember the surname, Gislan, who talks about the sagas of Iceland. Horrendous stories, but stories of families, stories of extraordinary violence, extraordinary torture, but incredibly important to the culture of Icelanders today. So I don't think we should delineate between what we would consider in 2020 as acceptable and not acceptable. It's just the way it was. I'm not sure that answers your question, but that's my best attempt.
Yeah, no, that's a great
Thank
thanks. Yeah. It's not something that people can impose from outside. It's something that people...
No, and it's the way, it is what it is, and there are some cultures that believe that sacrifice was important to the continuation of the rest of society. And if that's what it was, that's what it was. I'll take one more because my feet are getting really sore. Hello.
Hi, how did the Uluru Statement come about?
The Uluru Statement,
Thank you.
I skipped over some parts of my speech because it was getting quite long, but the Uluru Statement came about from, I think there were 12 dialogues across the country, right across the country, 12 big meetings of First Nations people from different areas coming together to talk about what the future should be. And it was a very organised, a very deliberative process and a very good process. Out of those 12 dialogues, people were nominated and voted on and given the imprimatur to attend the penultimate gathering, which was at Uluru, which was very symbolic as being the centre of Australia, where songlines met and a whole range of other things. That gathering at Uluru produced the document called the Uluru Statement. And what the Uluru Statement is, it is the most elegant piece of writing. If you haven't read it, it's not terribly long. Have a look at it, Google it tomorrow or tonight when you get home. And what the Uluru Statement was an invitation to the rest of the country to listen to the voice of Aboriginal people. And it is elegant, it is beautiful, and it is, as the Uluru Statement says, it's a cry from the heart. And it was, to put it in its bureaucratic sense, it was a report to what was a national council, I think for reconciliation, that was established as a bipartisan arrangement between the government and the opposition, and then that Uluru Statement, and I was in the meeting when Malcolm Turnbull said it will never work. It came to the Parliament, and what is happening now is technically the implementation of Uluru. And I didn't want to get particularly political tonight, but the unfortunate thing is that the present government, the Greens Party, have walked, in my view, away from what people asked for in the Uluru Statement. And the party that I represent, which has 3 First Nations, very senior people in the caucus by way of Patrick Dodson, Malandiri McCarthy and myself, are staying true to exactly what the Uluru Statement invited Australians to be part of. Does that explain it? Thank you. Thank you so much.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for your generosity, Linda. Look, we have a very small corporate gift. The Vice-Chancellor couldn't be here, sends his apologies. This is a beautiful piece of artwork by Claudia Barella. She's a very famous and accomplished glass artist and happens to be an alumnus of the University of Canberra. Absolutely gorgeous. So thank you for joining us. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you so very much. So lovely. Thank you. All right, we've got some food and some drinks, and please join us. If you can stick around and stay and mingle and say good day to Linda. I don't know if Linda's in a terrible great rush. No, that's good. Always checking to make sure the person who's organising. Thank you. Thank you all very much for coming along tonight. Hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Absolutely fantastic, Linda. So thank you very much. And again, just one more round of applause. Thank you so much.